all through the 90s. And that really is the crux of this, right? It is recovering one of our natural wonders and a native species to the state of Idaho. But it's really about recovery of this species. And I'll kind of bounce back and forth of you all, fortunately, are probably a little bit removed from some of the semantics and kind of narrative that I see. I live up in Moscow. I'm right on the Washington border, just north of Lewiston. So I get to hear the narrative from Eastern Washington congressional representatives and how great salmon and steelhead are doing. Well, that is the furthest from the truth. Like everything we do in TU, our position is based in science. I'm sure many of you know Helen Neville, who's our chief scientist, and the rest of her staff, and they really help us navigate and make these well-informed decisions to support these policies. The really great thing, though, is that even though we took this position in '98, it was shortly before that the comparative survival study started. Commonly, you'll hear us refer to it as CSS. It is now a 26-year data set examining survival throughout the hydro system. One of the benefits of the dams, there's lots of bad things about the dams, but one of the benefits is the dams really give an opportunity to handle and study and evaluate these species. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we are able to almost get it down to every single fish that returns to Snake River Basin. Historically, that had been through coded wire tags. Juveniles were tagged at that point in time. They had to be resampled as they returned as adults, transitioned into passive integrated tags, which are little tiny radio telemetry tags, and just swim through a radio wave, and the tag number is red. They know exactly where it was tagged, when it was tagged, how long it's been at the ocean, and now they've gone one step further to have genetic stock indexing. Genetic stock indexing is very specific to the wild species of all of these fish. For example, when I still worked for the department, I used to be stationed in Chalice, and in 2009, I did a Middle Fork trip. That trip was solely to collect Omicus fin samples. Omicus is rainbow trout or steelhead. And so that was kind of the baseline of gathering the genetic data so we could later identify these individual stocks. So now when these fish come through the dam, it's a fin clip, and then are genetically identified to come back to a very specific population. So really, really great accuracy now. And so really helps in determining the fitness and or lack of fitness of these species. Comparative survival studies based out of the Fish Passage Center. And it's a culmination, and this is what's really great, is that it's a culmination of a lot of entities that kind of remove the biasness of the data out of it. So you have the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and then the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission, which is made up of the Yakimas, the Nez Perce, the Warm Springs, and the Umatillas. So it's really great that it's a kind of a balanced data set. But the really interesting thing is that the Independent Scientific Advisory Board, they evaluate all this data in the annual reports that come out of CSS. And as you can read this here, and this was in 2021, one of the reports based on the CSS report is that with more than 25 years of data, the conclusions reached are now at the stage where the uncertainty in results are small and not just one-off artifacts of particular years. And so what that is telling us is that we know conclusively that the hydro system is the main mortality factor of salmon and steelhead coming back to the Snake River Basin. That is conclusive. After 25 years, the science is really kind of settled. This isn't about the science. We're not going to argue about science anymore. It turns into a social and economic argument now. Many of you are aware of who's the utility provider here?
Idaho.
Oh, Idaho Power. Okay, so you were not part of this, but Bonneville Power Authority oversees mitigation for the species. No different than Idaho Power does as well. They're culpable as well, but from a different perspective and their impacts in the Snake Canyon. Under the Bonneville Power is Northwest Power Conservation Council. They give directives to BPA of how to fund their mitigation efforts and also energy conservation work. They have goals, just like many entities in life, and their goals are based on recovery and rebuilding of these stocks. You'll hear us at TU commonly talk about SARs, or small to adult return ratios, and the Northwest Power Council recognizes that we need 2 to 6% with an average of 4 SAR to recover these fish. That is, put it in a more simple term, if you have 1 out of 100 return, 1 out of 100 juveniles return, that's 1%. Everybody's pretty smart in this room. You understand basic biology. You need more than 1 of any species to reproduce. It's an oversimplification, but I think it's probably the best way to really understand the premise. So we need between 2 and 6% with an average of 4%. And so if we look at this, the geometric mean SAR for wild spring Chinook from 1964 to 1969. So that was the time period as the hydro system was being built up. And when I refer to the hydro system, I talk about the entire lower Snake from Lower Granite all the way down to Ice Harbor, the 4 dams. Lower Granite wasn't completed yet. But at that time period, wild Chinook SARs were 4.3%. So within our 2 to 6% ideal range. As time goes on and we start to look at a different data set and different time periods, what we see now is 93 through 99. And remember, these species were listed in 92 for wild spring summer Chinook. And so during that time period, it was 1%. So we're back to that 1. We're not achieving our basic goal. We had a little uptick in the 2000s to 1.1%. More recently, 2010 to 2019, this would be Lower Granite to mouth of Columbia. Survival is 0.7%. So we're not even getting a 1% return rate. And this is really where I think for everybody that we talk to, and if you are having this discussion with somebody, these are really where it shines, and I think where we can really make sense and can really articulate the point. And what this map is our SARs throughout the Columbia Basin. And the great thing is that there's commonality, right? So they share the hydro system in a variety of ways, but overall they're sharing the same hydro system. Secondly, they share the same ocean conditions. You'll hear a lot of times that ocean conditions are the factor, and that's why we're not able to recover those fish. There is some validity to that, right? Ocean conditions are very poor, really do impact salmon and steelhead survival. But when we look at this, we really see that, well, that's not actually the case. And what we do is we start down on the lower left side in the Deschutes River. And keep in mind, this is for wild steelhead. Down on the Deschutes, and this data is the most recent 2022 comparative survival study data. The Deschutes River with 2 dam passages, so Bonneville and McNary, what you see is a 5.15% SAR, well within our 2 to 6% range. And as we move upriver, we go to the John Day River, so passing, or not McNary, now I got my dams all mixed up. McNary is upriver. Anyway, yeah. 3 dam passages through the Columbia. What we see is on the John Day, 4.05 SAR with 3 dam passages. Even as we go further upstream in the Columbia and go to the Yakima River, we're still seeing a 3.16% SAR. This is all sharing the same ocean conditions. So you can really start to see this correlation between dam passages, right? But then as we get to the Snake Basin, you can see on the far right in the red, the lower right there, after 8 dam passages, 16 if you count outmigration and return as adults, what we see for wild steelhead is 1.2%. And the wild fish are the fish that we're talking about. We're not overly concerned about hatchery fish. We're talking about recovering wild fish. And so that's really where we're at, is 1.2%. You know, the really interesting thing is that the Snake Basin, a portion of it, you know, it's literally a watershed divide. So you look at the Grand Ronde and the Imnaha in northeast Oregon, kind of drains out of the same geologic country as the John Day, but you see drastically different SARs, all relative to dam passages. And this one just shows for wild Chinook. Similar data set. We don't have wild Chinook SARs for the Deschutes, but on the John Day, even wild Chinook are still 2.9% SAR after 3 dam passages. The Yakima, 2.14%. So still within our 2 to 6%. But then we get to the Snake Basin and we see a 0.7%. And this is really the crux of it. I know as anglers, a lot of the times we like to talk about abundance, and I will here in a moment. But when we talk about recovery, SARs is really where the talking point is. Abundance is just a way for us, as I think anglers, to really rationalize what we see and what we think we need to see out there. But SARs is all about recovery. So if we talk about abundance, and this is going to come into play a little bit later. So this is a infographic out of the Columbia Basin Partnership Phase 2 final report. The Columbia Basin Partnership met pre-COVID for several years. Our Vice President of Western Conservation, Rob Massanis, represented TU on the partnership. Among 30 other individuals with very diverse backgrounds, from water users to utility district managers to irrigation representatives to agricultural representatives, government representatives, but they all came to this conclusion, are these abundance numbers. And if we look at what we saw historically to the Columbia Basin, or to the Snake River Basin, for spring, summer Chinook, historically it was 1 million fish. Will we ever get to 1 million? Absolutely not. And that is not really the point of any of this. This is about recovering the species to maintain its genetic resiliency and to proliferate throughout, the future. But right now, from a historical context, we're at 16% of what we used to see for a high historical. And you can see where the goals are and where they're set for each one of the species. It's important to note that coho are extricated from the system, from the snake, but there still is a motivation to recover them. And the Nez Perce currently has a pretty robust recovery plan for coho, and we actually do see fisheries mainly on the Clearwater River and then the Grand Ronde there in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. But those are abundance numbers. More recently, and I'll get to this in a little bit, is the importance of those mid-goal numbers. So just kind of let's lock them into kind of memory bank. I mentioned genetic stock indexing, the other way to really look at these numbers, and this really points out what is going on with wild Chinook returns to the Snake River Basin. And although we see ups and downs in these run numbers through genetic stock indexing, the reality is that dotted line is the trend line, and the trend is going down, not going up. And this is after 30 years of attempted recovery. So we're moving in the wrong direction for saving these fish. Same thing for wild steelhead. We do see some great jumps in abundance, but at the end of the day, our trend line is still trending in the wrong direction. Much of this has to do with outmigration conditions and getting out of the system quicker instead of being slowed up through the hydro system. Unfortunately, I think as all of you note, since I'm sure none of you have been skiing, it's pretty poor snowpack year. That translates into a pretty crappy outmigration environment for the fish. So unless we suddenly get dumped on snow, we aren't going to have a lot of water to push fish out. So survival through the hydro system will probably be worse this year. Bruce asked me to kind of briefly talk about economics. I think y'all understand the amount of money you individually spend to go fish. I think a lot of the public looks at this as a hobby. And how could you spend any money just going out fishing? How does that translate into economic stimulus? Well, I think we all in this room understand that very clearly, and what economic stimulus we provide to go partake, to go angling. I'm not even going to go say to go catch fish, because how many of you actually are really sacking them up, other than Eric, I guess. But you know, a huge driver where I live in Moscow and in the Lewiston, Clarkston economy is our B-run Steelhead. That's a picture from the fall before. That's the NRS fishing product manager. That's a big B-run hatchery fish that we caught on the Clearwater. And you can really see what the driver is, right? I mean, no offense, because I used to live at Chalice and I used to fish on the upper Salmon for those little A-run fish. But now I live and can fish the Clearwater and can catch the big B-runs. So pretty spectacular fish. Some of you may be familiar with this. In 2001, Idaho saw a really great, robust Chinook fishery and a hatchery fish return. It was one of the, still to this day, one of the record returns for hatchery fish in 2001. It was a pretty spectacular fishery. We had very, very limited fisheries before that. And this one, I think the daily limit on Chinook Den was probably 4 fish, if I remember correctly. I mean, it was unbelievable opportunity. Well, the Idaho Fish and Wildlife Foundation did an economic study on it. And at that time, and granted, we're talking about 2001, anglers spent an average of $307 per trip during just a 2.5-month season for spring and summer Chinook. If we adjust that for inflation in 2022 numbers, not 2023 numbers, we're looking at that trip would be valued at $506 per trip. You move it on a little bit further, it was at that time estimated to provide $8.8 million of economic impact in Lewiston in 2001. Today, that would be valued at approximately $14.5 million in 2.5 months. That's just in Lewiston. Who's been to Lewiston? When's the last time you've been to Lewiston? Yeah, so it's still the same. The economics in Lewiston has not moved. It's has the lowest economic development in the entire state based on the 7 regions in the state. Never mind the promise that was made that the dams would make Lewiston rich. It has not. But here we have proof, you know, that recreationally angling really puts in some dollars into these economies that are really lacking. You know, the timber base that once was there in a lot of the river communities further up, Orofino, Kuski, Kamei, the timber base isn't there anymore. And so every last dollar really counts. And if we look at it even a little bit more recently, in 2019, there was a steelhead closure on the Clearwater River. Some of you may remember this. That closure was based on concerns that the state was not going to make broodstock. So hatchery returning fish had no consideration for wild returns, had consideration for the lack of broodstock that would return, and had to make sure that they would get enough hatchery fish to have enough eggs to propagate the next generation. So the fishery was closed, I think it was October 19th of 2019, remained closed until December 31st. The Idaho Department of Labor estimated that the direct to tertiary ripple effects of lost economic input was $8.7 million within the Clearwater economic region. That's Lewiston, Orofino, Kamei, and Kuski, just in that 2.5 months of a closure. So very, very significant, you know. And so when you think about the economics and what we're fishing on now, a fraction of what used to return, very limited opportunity, and what could be in the future if we can recover these fish. So why invest big in Snake River salmon recovery? This is really important considering climate change, and we're literally seeing it today. 20% of the total amount of accessible stream habitat in the current and native distribution of West Coast, not including Alaska, salmon and steelhead habitat is what the Snake River makes up. 20%, pretty impressive, with about 30,000 miles of stream habitat. There's 8,500 miles of designated critical habitat, but in total, there's about 30,000 stream miles accessible to salmon and steelhead within the Snake River Basin. 40% of the current cold water habitat, and that will only go up and become more significant as we see climate change. The sawtooths that are in your backyard are incredibly valuable to the Snake Basin. It holds, that snowpack really long, trickles out that cold water throughout the summer, and really is the gold standard when we come to habitat. That combined with wilderness designations, either the Frank Church in the Middle Fork and the Selway Vineyard Complex in the Selway, and portions of the Locksaw with wild and scenic. It really is an unbelievable opportunity that we have to recover these fish because the habitat is mostly intact and will remain intact and become more valuable even with climate change. And it's really important to recognize, we saw that million number mark for historical return to spring summer Chinook, but in reality, the snake contributed 50% of the salmon and steelhead return to the mouth of the Columbia. This is an estimate by NOAA based on a further estimate of 10 to 16 million salmon and steelhead that returned to the mouth of the Columbia. The Snake River accounted for 50% of those. So you really get a clear picture of how important this basin is and what the opportunity would actually translate to if we can get those damn dams out. So we have this once in a lifetime opportunity, and we saw this ball start to roll recently, right? With Representative Simpson and his announcement in 2021, which all of you, I hope you sent a letter of thanks to Representative Simpson as your representative down here. Pretty bold move for a conservative Republican from the state of Idaho to do. But as you all probably saw and bared witness, it kind of landed like a fart in church. Nobody really glommed onto the idea, and the West Side, the West Coast Democrats like to consider themselves environmentalists, but nobody really jumped on this opportunity with Representative Simpson. A very bold proposal, $30.5 billion invested into the region to include dam breaching, but nobody really glommed onto that opportunity. But what we saw is that really changed the narrative around dam breaching. And for the first time in 30 years since we've been talking about doing this, we have seen this really increased fever pitch of conversation about breach, one that can no longer be avoided. And we did see some reaction from Washington electeds. But the reality is if we don't change the way we're doing things now, there is a little bit of an idea, I think, in this room, right? Well, how does it affect me more than just my, future desire to want to perpetuate a species and/or opportunity? I think I look at this a lot as, listen, we're all neighbors here. I might live in Moscow, but we have a relationship somehow. I'm sure some of you go over and fish the upper salmon in the Sawtooth Basin, and those fish swim by me to get here. And so we all share them in one way or another, and we are all interconnected. And I think that is really the moral of the story about this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is an opportunity for all of us, not just us as anglers, but us as a region, us as a community. So if we don't change what we're doing, the management of the hydro system will become very uncertain. Kind of the air's been taken a little bit out of my sails on this, only because the stay agreement that was announced on December 15th with the litigants in the current BIOP case in the lawsuit again with the U.S. government. But in reality, if the stay doesn't go through, the judge will impose restrictions on the hydro system, whether that's in spill or operational mandates that will make transportation of grain, which is part of this conversation. And the other side of economics is that I live on the Palouse. The Palouse is very, very fertile, and one of the best growing places for wheat. Wheat that does not go into Wonder Bread. And that's kind of the people are like, well, geez, can't they just like keep this wheat within state and just process it here to make white bread? Well, it's not that kind of wheat. And this is something that I've learned over the course of time doing this work, is that this is the highest grade wheat that is used in markets in Japan and Italy, specifically in noodle markets. It's such a high grade with high gluten content that's where they use it. And that's where all this grain is exported. Again, a lot of economic incentive to maintain some portion of the agricultural industry we have. In addition to that, electricity is a huge driver. Although you are all customers of Idaho Power, and unfortunately I'm a customer of Vista, and similar to Idaho Power, we get our electricity from our own own dams. And so not a BPA customer, but with mandates within the hydro system, electricity production will wane. And so uncertainty is without a doubt forthcoming. So, and the other important thing is that salmon recovery obligation is not going away. These are endangered species. The Endangered Species Act trumps pretty much everything else out there on the land. And so NOAA released a report in September of 2022 stating for Snake River stocks, the centerpiece action is restoring the lower Snake River via dam breaching, this was very monumental in 2022 when this announcement was made. It was the first time that NOAA, a federal agency, acknowledged that dam breaching was the centerpiece for recovery. There was no more Band-Aids to try to recover these fish. Dam breaching is the centerpiece. And restoring more normalized reach scale hydrology and hydraulics, and thus river conditions and functions in Lower Snake requires dam breaching. There is no way around this. As I mentioned, litigation to increase spill, and then lower pool levels. Again, Endangered Species Act trumps everything. First and foremost, this is something that has become, I've gained a lot more understanding and appreciation for tribal treaty rights. I have developed a pretty close relationship with the chairman of the Nez Perce tribe now. And I will never understand as a white person or a non-tribal member what salmon or steelhead mean to tribal members, but I am gaining an understanding. And I can tell you now that if there is one reason that we do this or two reasons that we do this, one, to recover a threatened endangered species, but it's for our obligations that our forefathers had with the tribes of the Northwest. Again, we talked about investing in communities. Moscow, yeah, we have the University of Idaho. It's a pretty serious economic driver in our community, but grain, wheat, lentils, garbanzos, peas are huge, huge drivers in an agricultural industry and community like Moscow is, like Lewiston, Clarkston, Grangeville. Very, very important. And it's time to invest in clean energy. We like to talk about how hydro is green and clean. In reality, anything that kills something else is not clean or green. That's just the reality. So we can pivot away from hydro. We're still going to have impacts. If we go to solar or if we go to wind, we're still going to have impacts. That's just the reality. It's just how do you weigh the impacts, right? And so I think, one of the bigger, issues that comes up is, geez, how do we justify spending at the time $30.5 billion as was in Representative Simpson's proposal? Well, why not? Why not spend that on our region? If we look, the Everglades restoration costs $23 billion. $23 billion is what they funded to restore the Everglades back into a functioning ecosystem. Chesapeake Bay cleanup was $15 billion. What makes them more important than our region? And so one way to really look at that. So we kind of pivot now from to certainty, and that's in litigation. So I mentioned on December 15th, a motion to stay was submitted in response to the current litigation over the BIOP in the federal, the Columbia River System operations. That motion is an agreement, 5-year agreement among the parties and the U.S. government to stay the litigation till 2028. As a result of that, there is an MOU, and it comes in the form of the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative, which is very, very expansive. And it really builds off the foundation of what Representative Simpson had started. And really a lot of the stuff that Representative Simpson had put forth was fine-tuned, and we see that in the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative now. I think, well, hold on here. So the U.S. government now has commitments in support of the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative. That is part of this stay. And I'll get into that, all those in a bit. So I mentioned that there's a 5-year stay, but there's a 10-year interim operations commitment for the Lower Snake. So they have 5 years stay commitment now. They can re-up for another 5 years for a culmination of 10 years. But interim operations is a commitment for 10 years, kind of no matter what, whether or not they extend the stay or not. And so it really is a pivot point again in this idea of restoring the Lower Snake. Parties had until December 29th to file opposition to the stay, and 2 parties did file opposition. Inland Ports and Navigation Group and our beloved state of Idaho filed opposition to it. And so now from that point on, the moving parties have until January 12th to respond. So we're not quite there yet. So it'll be we'll be kind of in a holding pattern until we really figure out what happens and if they are able to address these concerns that the opposition has brought forth. Inland Ports and Navigation Group are the port districts, so the Port of Lewiston, all the ports through the lower Snake, and then the Navigation Group, primarily the barge owners. But I'm going to keep going since we still have plenty of time. So the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative is really, really bold in some of the things that are in there. And what I've done, there's I think total 7 objectives within the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative, and I just pulled out the 4 that really impact the Snake River Basin. So objectives 1 and 1B, develop and advance an urgent comprehensive strategy to restore salmon and steelhead to healthy and abundant levels. That's what those levels that we saw in the Columbia Basin Partnership were, are healthy and abundant. And then 2, complete the actions and investments necessary to secure continuity of services. Services are energy generation through the hydro system. The 4 lower Snake River dams contribute about 5% to the overall Northwest grid, 5%. On average, it's about 960 megawatts. Nameplate capacity is right around 3,000 megawatts. So, well, ideally, they will replace more than what nameplate is. The states of Oregon and Washington have clean energy mandates that have to be met. And as we transition away from coal and other fossil fuels, it's better to build out, right? You want to build bigger than what you need. Objective 4, invest in and support communities and economic sectors. Again, this is trying to pivot away from what we see now with energy. We discussed that. One of the really big investments in energy is tribal energy sovereignty. If you have not heard about it, the Nez Perce tribe have started what's called Nimipu Energy. You can search Google and see a short video on YouTube about Nimipu Energy. For somebody that was in Lapwai all the time, driving through by the casino all the time, I had no idea that this was happening. And what they did is put solar panels on pretty much all their infrastructure. You can't really tell that they're there, They back that up with Tesla mega batteries. One of the arguments, right, with solar is, well, geez, when the sun's not shining, there's no electricity. When the wind's not blowing, there's no electricity. They kind of leave out that whole storage thing, you know? And so it's a really important part of this conversation is to be able to have the storage capacity. So when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, we still have electricity. And that's what the NISPers have done. They have built out a pretty expansive and have a very much more bold initiative to create a lot of solar energy on their tribal, on their reservation, on their lands. And it's pretty amazing. They have committed themselves to 510 megawatts in replacement. That's just themselves. Overall, they want to replace 5,000. And that is through agreement and participation with other tribes throughout the entire West and creating a virtual energy grid. There is a huge amount of money in the Infrastructure Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law specifically for tribal energy development. And so that is all earmarked and part of this, negotiation. Again, I mentioned transportation. We specifically, agricultural commodities, use the hydro system for transportation. If you're ever down to Lewiston, you'll see the Port of Lewiston, the Lewis and Clark terminal, and that's where they load large grain barges to be transported down all the way to the Columbia and then loaded on huge ocean-going ships. So those are the things that need to be replaced. It talks about recreation. There seems to be a bunch of people that recreate on the lower Snake and the hydro system. I can tell you, I go walleye fishing down there, and I get this a lot at TU presentation. What the hell is a walleye? Like I have pictures in some of my presentations of a walleye. People are like, hey, Eric, what's that fish? Well, it's not a trout. It eats the heck out of salmon and steelhead, though. And so in the spring, you'll see barges going by left and right. And during spring Chinook season, they go right through where everybody Chinook fishes, and you kind of got to move your boat out of the way as this barge and tugboat come barreling through. This is a big one, and this is an important part of this conversation, is securing necessary regulatory compliance and authorizations and appropriations to implement this larger strategy. So we still have to meet NEPA requirements, which can be a huge hurdle at times. And so that's part of this, right? Same with appropriations. And so, anybody that has followed this issue through the course of time and have engaged with us, with TU National, on the Lower Snake campaign, I think that if you were paying attention on December 15th, you're like, wow, I got time to focus on something else, some other really important fisheries issue. Well, now is not the time to forget about the Lower Snake. Now is the time to push the pedal down and really get after it. And we still need your voices all the time. Part of that is putting pressure on the congressional naysayers. Your two senators, Senator Crapo and Senator Risch, are pretty opposed. Have quite a bit of opposition to this. Representative Fulcher, which isn't your representative, but he's mine, is frankly out to lunch on the issue. And so we still need to put pressure on them. And so that we'll be asking you to continually do that in the coming months and probably the coming years. This is by no means over. And I think if you look back and you look at one of our really great wins recently was Bristol, right? And Pebble Mine and putting a stop to that. That was a 20-year campaign by TU, 20 years. And although we've been fighting about the Lower Snake for 30 plus, really, the fever pitch just happened in 2019 when Representative Simpson released his initial release at the Andrus Center Symposium talking about breach. That's really when this Lower Snake conversation really started to get engaging. Another really great win that we can hang our hats on, and this should motivate you, that we can do hard things as conservationists, and we can win, is Klamath. Those dams are coming down. Now, granted, these are much different scenarios. Klamath and Elwha, much different scenarios. They were regulated by FERC. They were privately owned. There was a decision because of cost analysis to retire those dams. A little bit different. We're talking about congressional authorization to remove these dams. These dams were authorized in 1948 by the Safe Rivers and Harbors Act by Congress, and it's believed that only Congress can authorize their removal. And so that's where we need you all to stay focused and engaged. Again, this comes back to honoring federal, Objective 6, honoring federal commitments to the tribal nations. This has become kind of a really focus of mine and the undoing of what our obligations, our forefathers obligated us as non-tribal members and citizens of the United States to our tribal nations. They have really been disenfranchised. Our end of the bargain was not held up. Chairman Wheeler likes to always talk about a coin, and it's a really great analogy. You know, that a coin is minted, and although they have two different sides, they're minted to the same coin. And anything affecting one side is going to affect the other side. And so you would not want to do harm to the other side of the coin with any intent. And so, but that in this case is what really has happened. And it's a really great analogy of really, you know, it's the tribes and the US government minted together. And so it's this balance in making sure that the coin stays solvent. So in total, I just broke down the three really important parts of the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative. And again, the responsiveness of the government is lower stake river restoration, dam breaching. One of the side commitments is reintroduction of salmon in the Upper Columbia. That is a commitment to the Colvilles, the Coeur d'Alenes, and the Spokane tribes. Mid-Columbia River restoration, or salmon and steelhead improvements. That's cold water refugia. You hear a lot about cold water refugia in the Columbia during the summer months when the Columbia gets superheated. These fish really depend on these cold water refuges. The Deschutes, the John Day, create these huge cold water plumes that these fish can kind of stay over in until the rest of the hydro system kind of mitigates and they can get back up through. So that'll be improvements to that. There's a lot of culvert work in the state of Washington for passage. Other native fish are a huge centerpiece of this, specifically lampreys, which have cultural significance for the tribes. Bull trout, oddly, when I'm sure some of you go over on the other side of the hill and catch the heck out of bull trout. Seems to be no shortage of them in the upper salmon, but bull trout is another centerpiece fish, as well as sturgeon, white sturgeon in the Snake River. Since the damming, sturgeon populations have continued to drop, and the age structure is no longer of these ancient fish that once were. It's a smaller sized age class, younger age class that it takes 30 years for them to reach sexual maturity, and so there'll be more emphasis on those species along with some other native fish. Improved ecosystem function. Interim fish operations, that has to do with spill through the system to get juveniles out of the hydro system quicker. And then also minimize mortality at the dams through spill. In addition to that, it's a bunch of operations and maintenance of a lot of the federal hatcheries. They have been underfunded and are literally falling apart. Even though they provide that interim opportunity, a mandated mitigation opportunity for us that angle for them. It's still important for the economies for non-tribal and tribal fisheries. Modernization of energy and other economic sectors, we already kind of talked about that. And then the authorization studies and timelines and basin-wide funding commitments. Again, there's a whole bunch of money in the Infrastructure Reduction Act and then the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, but there'll be future needs for Congress to act to appropriate funds. Fisheries management and other partnership commitments. Right now, fisheries throughout the Columbia Basin are pretty much primarily managed under USV Oregon. That dictates 50% go to tribes, 50% go to non-tribal entities, states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And that's how these fisheries are mandated. Those are based on hatchery returns. In addition to that, a lot of the funding mechanisms, as we talked about, come from the Northwest Power Council, and those mitigation dollars spilling from BPA. A full third of BPA customer power rate bills go towards mitigation of salmon and steelhead, a full third of a power bill. And so part of that is recognizing that every last dollar that is coming from BPA or coming from ratepayers to BPA is spent on fisheries mitigation. So yeah, that's the end. One thing you can all do is, if you haven't already, is go to tu.org/lower snake. That is our landing page. You can take action. One, send a letter to one of your congressmen. In addition to that, you can stay informed. We are constantly pumping out information depending on what's going on, and it's a good way to stay informed and engaged on the issue. Beyond that, this is about having local conversations. Many times I hear from all of our grassroots membership, like, how can I be engaged? What can I do? And sometimes it's really hard to keep y'all motivated. And that's not a fault of you or us. It's just, I think that you want to see a return on your investment, right? You want to see a return for all your efforts. And I can say that because of all your efforts, we are at this incredible point in time where quite feasibly, within 10 years, we could see the dams on the lower snake coming down. But again, you can't stall out now. We need you. So you need to still have these conversations. And I said, not only is this engagement of congressional electeds, but it's local electeds. This is as much an Idaho issue as anything. And when you see the state of Idaho filing opposition to the stay, you know something's probably not right. So this is about having those conversations with even your county commissioners, your local electeds, whether it's the mayor, your county commissioners, state representatives, state senators. It's all there, and it's promoting salmon and steelhead and the recovery of this incredible species. So thanks. A lot there to unpack. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. But thanks for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. Go ahead, Nick.
Eric, I'll start. One thing you didn't really cover in much detail, but it's really central, I think, where Idaho politics move on. This is the ag industry. And where are they and what can move from? I had heard before, uninterpreted and researched, that you could actually move all that stuff that you're currently moving by barge to Portland, which is a shallow water port, by rail to Seattle and Tacoma, which are deep water ports. And I guess the question I have is, does the ag industry buy into that, or is that are they still saying we got to have our barges?
So there is a portion that say they have to have their barges. There is another portion that come back to this certainty issue, and so they're trying to figure out, like, geez, like, I've kind of looked at the whole thing over the last several years that I've been doing it as kind of, it's a bad analogy, but it's the best analogy. It's this idea of whack-a-mole, you know, is that if the mole sticks his head out of the hole, he's going to get whacked by his buddies, unfortunately. And so that's really what we see, and we need to, you know, build an opportunity for the industry to really be at the table and have great input in a pivot and having the right people at the table in the industry. They can keep saying that they don't want to pivot away from barge because it's cost effective. A lot of this is cost, right? It's cheap to transport through the hydro system. It's cheap to transport through the hydro system because we, as taxpayers, mitigate that and keep the maintenance and operations going. In small forms, but that's the reality of it. It is subsidized 100%, and that's the only way it's feasible. The other thing is really important. It is a thing about time. It is extremely quick, oddly, to get huge barges down the river to these deep water ports, as Nick is talking about. There is already rail infrastructure in Lewiston. It's not set up for what's called a unit loader. That's a 116 car train specifically for hauling grain. And that's where that's the breaking point, and that's really where it makes it feasible. But it's all about timing, it's all about facilities. And some of the industry has already pivoted to that. We already see in the Northern Palouse up in McCoy that the Pacific Northwest Co-op, P&W Co-op, they built a multi-million-dollar unit loader terminal on the Northern Palouse years ago because they knew something was going to be inevitable and they needed to somehow provide some certainty. So yes, Nick, there is that opportunity, and as much as I love coming to talk to all of you about the issue, you all agree with me. This is like easy to come talk to you. I end up spending a lot of my time talking to the ag industry and the various sectors of it. That's where I spend a lot of my time, and trying to help them understand our point and educate myself on their points and getting those people to the table. Yep, go ahead.
It's my understanding that Port Lewiston has been operating in the red, and that there's been a decrease in barge traffic.
Yep.
That looks a little bit like the Steelhead.
Yeah.
To where there were only 17 barges year before last.
Yeah. So so again, a lot of this. So you can't look at it as just grain barges. There used to be, there used to, well, no, it's all going down.
Yeah.
And so some of it is the result of petroleum products no longer being shipped on the hydro system, transitioning to some other one. Wood products is another big thing. You know, the Clearwater mill there still transports a bunch of wood products via train, but not, or via barge, but not like they used to. And that's where you start to see this decrease in the amount of barge traffic. And
but there's, I think, only one major barge company left on the river.
So it's
Tidewater.
It's Tidewater, yeah. And Shaver's down further. There's 2 million that operate in the system, but it's Tidewater and Shaver. But yeah, but so you know, you all have probably heard Chris Wood, you know, say this really great statement. You know, hey, we can generate electricity a multitude of different ways. We can transport commodities a multitude of different ways. We've already shown that. But you know what we can't do? We can't take the fish out of the river, or the fish out of the river. The fish need a river, and that is the only solution, is a free-flowing river. They have one option, and that's a free-flowing river. Everything else, there's options. So.
When we tried that, it's most.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yep, in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for bringing up the tribal connections. I think that's really important stuff. And wanted to put in a plug for a fabulous film called The Covenant of the Salmon People.
Yeah.
It's so poignant. It was screened here. If you missed it, it's available on Idaho Public Broadcasting.
Yeah, and I would say, like
Stream.
Yeah, and I would say, who did go see it? It's clearly you did. Yeah. All right. So here's one thing I would like kind of put out to y'all as a chapter, is to host another showing. Literally, Ed saw it when we had our annual meeting in Spokane. I have literally seen it 5 times. 5 times I've seen this movie, and every time it brings a tear to my eye. Every single time. Because I pick something up, I kind of recognize that, you know, I might not personally be at fault to this, but I am responsible for this. And so it is probably one of the most powerful movies that you could watch in recognition of the lower snake and what these fish really mean for the tribes, the ecosystem. It is really, really unbelievable. And I would say, if you have the opportunity and the bandwidth as a chapter to host another showing, it's really easy to do. It's free. The film is free. It's just, you got to find a venue and do the legwork as a chapter. But that would be one thing. And I know the chairman would very much appreciate that. I'm going in February back to Pennsylvania. As much as I love the Idaho Council and how engaged y'all are, Pennsylvania Council is pretty unbelievable and what they do and the size of it. And so I'm going back to talk about Lower Snake to this Keystone Coldwater Conference that the council actually puts on with the state chapter of the American Fisheries Society. And I don't know if I actually did con them, but they agreed to show Covenant the one night at that Covenant, all the way back in Pennsylvania. They saw the trailer and they're like, yeah, we'll definitely do this. So one thing that y'all can do, it is a powerful, powerful film.
Look how much money was spent from places like that on the Pebble Mine.
Yeah.
The money on this subject comes all over.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Any other questions?
One final question. I read somewhere just recently, the mitigation money, instead of being managed by BPA, is going to the tribal council.
Well, to the sovereigns. So
Which
to the
is
four,
not-
the four tribes, the state of Washington, Oregon. That is in the group, the MOU, and then some of the other stakeholders.
Which isn't part of the 300 million that came out of the administration. But that's just.
No, this is Bonneville's mitigation responsibilities
Yeah.
that they want say in it, because there are a bunch of shenanigans about how things get funded. Part of what I do is I don't usually attend them; I just watch them online. But it's the Power Council meetings every month. I watch the conservation meetings, and more recently, oddly, the Power Council has been complaining about BPA and changes in project agreements, and that the council's not being notified. And BPA is just kind of doing whatever the hell they want to do. And so, yeah, it's a really big change, and it's a really incredible time for salmon steelhead in the basin and for lower Snake River dams, and literally a glimpse into the future of what a free-flowing snake might look like. So,
Or these, because they're federal dams, do they not have to do FERC relicensing?
no, they're not FERC regulated. Yep. It's literally congressional authorization. So much different than what we see in Klamath and Elwha. Anything else? Thanks for having me.